Jerry woke up to the sound of heavy machinery growling outside his window. His heart slammed against his ribs as he threw off the covers, scrambling to his feet. Something was wrong. His sleepy mind struggled to process what was happening, but as soon as he yanked open the blinds, his blood ran cold. There, at the edge of his property, a massive yellow excavator sat idling, its engine rumbling like a hungry beast ready to devour. A group of men in neon vests stood near the curb, one of them holding a clipboard, another one stretching caution tape across his driveway. Jerry's stomach churned as panic clawed at his throat. He barely had time to grab his phone before he heard the loudspeakers blaring from the truck parked nearby. By order of the homeowner association, this property is scheduled for demolition due to noncompliance with community standards. His brain short-circuited for a second. Demolition? What community standards? He didn't even belong to their stupid HOA. He yanked open the door and stormed outside, barefoot, adrenaline flooding his veins. HEY, he bellowed, waving his arms. What the hell do you think you're doing? The man with the clipboard barely glanced up before returning to his note. Sir, please stand back. This is an authorized operation. Jerry gawked at him. Authorized by who? He already knew the answer. His heart pounded as his gaze flicked across the street, and sure enough, there she was. Brenda, the HOA president, standing on her front porch, arms crossed, watching with the smug satisfaction of a queen overseeing a peasant's punishment. His hands curled into fists as white-hot rage pulsed through him. He had expected the HOA's usual petty antics, passive-aggressive letters, ridiculous fines, maybe another fake warning about his trash bins being unsightly. But this? This was a declaration of war. It had started months ago when Jerry, a software engineer tired of the city's relentless noise and congestion, finally found his dream retreat, a quaint vacation home nestled at the edge of a quiet, tree-lined community. The place was perfect, private, peaceful, and most importantly, not under the rule of an HOA. He had made sure of that before buying the property, double-checking the boundaries and confirming with the seller, an old-timer named Paul who had gleefully told him, "I built this house outside their grip on purpose. Best decision I ever made." That was all Jerry needed to hear. He signed the papers, packed his weekend's bags, and for the first time in years, he had a slice of paradise to escape to. Life was good. The first few weeks were everything he had dreamed of. No sirens, no honking horns, no screaming neighbors. Just the chirping of birds, the rustling of trees, and the occasional deer wandering through his backyard. He spent his evenings on the deck with a beer, watching the sunset, convinced he had found his own little corner of heaven. Then, one day, a letter arrived. It came in a crisp white envelope with an official-looking seal. Jerry had opened it absent-mindedly, expecting some junk mail or maybe a friendly note from a neighbor. Instead, he found a warm but firm invitation from the homeowner association, welcoming him to the community and encouraging him to join their ranks. The letter was filled with nauseatingly cheerful phrases about maintaining neighborhood harmony and ensuring property values remain at their highest. But the real kicker was the closing line. Someone from our board will be reaching out soon to discuss your membership and next steps. Jerry had frowned, reading it twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. There was no next step. He wasn't part of the HOA. His house wasn't even within their jurisdiction. It had to be a mistake. He tossed the letter aside and thought nothing of it. A week later, another letter came. This one wasn't as friendly. It reminded him that community participation was highly encouraged and strongly recommended, that he consider signing up before any conflicts arose. Conflicts? Jerry scoffed, tossing the letter into the trash. It was starting to feel more like a threat than an invitation. Then came the notices. First, it was a warning about his lawn not meeting community aesthetic standards. He received a fine for having his trash bins visible from the street. Then there was a letter claiming his house's paint color was not in line with neighborhood expectations. each one more absurd than the last. Jerry knew exactly what was happening. They were trying to force his hand, wearing him down with constant harassment until he gave in. But he wasn't the kind of guy who caved under pressure. He had no intention of joining their HOA, and he wasn't about to start paying ridiculous fees for rules that didn't even apply to him. He called a lawyer just to be safe and was reassured that legally, he was in the clear. The HOA had no authority over him. Confident in that knowledge, he wrote a polite but firm letter declining their offer, making it crystal clear that he was not, and never would be, part of their association. That's when things got ugly. The next day, he found a bright orange sign staked into his yard. This property does not comply with HOA standards. Then came the anonymous complaint letters, allegedly from concerned neighbors, who didn't appreciate his lack of community spirit. He started finding odd things around his property: dead leaves and branches dumped onto his driveway, trash mysteriously appearing overnight, his mailbox slightly bent out of shape. One morning, he discovered someone had spray-painted "Join or Leave" on his fence. The HOA denied any involvement, of course. Must have been some local kids, Brenda had said, her smile just a little too pleased. Jerry installed security cameras, but the harassment continued, always just subtle enough to avoid clear evidence of who was behind it. It was a mind game, and they were playing dirty. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to waking up to the sound of demolition equipment outside his house. Jerry's mind snapped back to the present as he stood in his driveway, heart hammering, fists clenched. The workers were still there, waiting for the go-ahead, and Brenda was still watching, waiting for him to break. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "If any of you so much as touch my house, I will have every single one of you arrested for trespassing and destruction of property." The clipboard guy hesitated, his pen hovering over the paper. Jerry pulled out his phone and started recording. "Let's get one thing straight. I am not part of your HOA. You have no authority over me. So unless you want to explain to the cops why you're illegally demolishing private property, I suggest you pack up and leave." There was a long, tense silence. Then, the clipboard guy turned to his crew and gave a half-hearted shrug. "Stand down," he muttered. The workers exchanged uncertain glances, then started backing away, shutting off their equipment. Jerry exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders loosen just a fraction. He had won this round. But as he turned back toward his house, he saw Brenda still standing there, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she smirked, turned on her heel, and walked away. Jerry had no idea what she was planning next. But he knew one thing for certain: this fight was far from over. Jerry thought the worst was over after stopping the demolition crew, but he should have known better. The HOA wasn't just going to walk away after being humiliated like that. The moment Brenda smirked and turned away, he felt it in his gut. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something worse. The next day, he found another notice taped to his door, this one even more aggressive than before. It claimed his property had been flagged as a persistent community concern, and that he had exactly 1 week to resolve the outstanding violations or face further action. Further action? He scoffed at the wording, tossing the paper onto his kitchen counter. What were they going to do, fine him again? Send another crew? He had already made it clear they had no legal authority over his property. His lawyer had reassured him time and time again that the HOA couldn't enforce their rules on a house that wasn't within their jurisdiction. But logic didn't seem to apply to Brenda and her band of power-hungry enforcers. It didn't take long for the next round of harassment to start. First, it was the mail. Every time he checked his mailbox, it was overflowing, not just with official HOA letters, but with random junk. Piles of real estate advertisements, community bulletins, and oddly enough, old newspapers dated from weeks ago. It was as if someone had deliberately stuffed it full to annoy him. Then came the complaints. The first one was laughable, a formal notice accusing him of failing to maintain a welcoming aesthetic. The wording was so vague it could mean anything. Then came another one, this time about excessive debris on the property, which was interesting because he had cleaned his yard just the day before. And then the most absurd one yet, a letter stating his lawn furniture was in violation of approved styles. He read that one twice just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Since when did they regulate furniture styles? Was his deck chair really such an affront to community values? But the HOA had moved beyond just paperwork. One evening, he was heading home from work when he noticed something strange near his driveway. A large pile of leaves and branches had been dumped onto his lawn, right next to his trash cans. It wasn't just a few stray pieces. It was deliberate. He pulled over, stepping out of his car, his mind already racing. Was this just the wind, or was someone trying to make it look like he wasn't maintaining his property? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It could have been a coincidence, but by now, he knew better. He spent the next hour cleaning it up, feeling the heat of frustration settle in his chest. The moment he finished, he heard a rustling sound from the street and turned just in time to see someone duck behind a parked car. His jaw clenched. He wasn't crazy. Someone was watching. Someone was messing with him. He pulled out his phone, ready to start recording, but by the time he got closer, they were gone. The next morning, he installed more security cameras. If they wanted to play dirty, fine. But he was going to make sure they got caught. Then came the flamingos. He didn't notice them at first, but when he stepped outside for his morning coffee, he nearly choked. His front yard was covered in them. Dozens of bright pink plastic flamingos scattered across the grass like some kind of tacky art installation. His eyes widened as he stepped forward, trying to process what he was looking at. Who the hell did this? A sharp laugh made him turn, and there she was, Brenda, standing across the street, sipping coffee from a HOA-branded mug. "Good morning, Jerry," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with fake innocence. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Jerry exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to throw something. "You think this is funny?" She shrugged, taking another sip. "I just assumed you liked making a statement. You know, considering how uncooperative you've been." His fists clenched at his sides. "You're trespassing." Again. Brenda smiled, completely unfazed. "Oh, I wouldn't call it trespassing. The flamingos? They're just a friendly gift. A way to brighten up the neighborhood." Jerry looked back at the ridiculous display and let out a dry laugh. "Oh, you want to play games? Fine." That afternoon, he went out and bought twice as many flamingos. If they wanted a war of pettiness, he would give them one. The next morning, Brenda found her own yard covered in an army of pink plastic birds. He even arranged them in a formation spelling out an OHOA. He stood back, arms crossed, watching from his porch as Brenda stormed out, her face red with fury. "You're making a fool of yourself," she snapped, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at him. "No," he said, smirking, "I'm just playing by your rules." But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Days later, Jerry arrived home to find something new waiting for him, a large, official-looking sign posted at the edge of his property. His stomach dropped as he got closer, reading the bold print. "Notice of unsafe structure. Demolition pending." His heart pounded as he tore the sign from the ground, scanning for any indication of who had posted it. And then, just like clockwork, another letter arrived in his mailbox, this one claiming that an anonymous inspection had deemed his home a safety hazard and that he would be required to pay $5,000 in compliance fees or face potential legal action. Jerry saw red. This wasn't just a joke anymore. This was an all-out attack. He stormed across the street, fists clenched, knocking on Brenda's door with more force than necessary. When she opened it, she was still wearing that same smug smile. "Jerry," she said, feigning surprise. "What a pleasant, cut the crap," he snapped, shoving the letter toward her. "You know damn well this is fake." She blinked, tilting her head. I have no idea what you're talking about. An inspection? From who? The HOA doesn't have the authority to inspect my property, let alone label it unsafe. She pursed her lips, pretending to consider. Well, Jerry, some of the neighbors have expressed concerns. It's our duty to ensure the community remains safe and aesthetically pleasing. His grip tightened on the letter. If you so much as try to send another fake fine, I will take legal action. And if I catch one of your goons stepping foot on my property again, I'll have them arrested. Her smile finally faltered, just a little, but she wasn't done yet. Oh, Jerry, she sighed dramatically. You really should just cooperate. It would make things so much easier for everyone. He glared at her. Easier for who? You. She didn't answer, just offered a slow, knowing smirk before closing the door in his face. Jerry didn't sleep much that night. He had dealt with pettiness before, but this was beyond that. Brenda wasn't just trying to annoy him, she was trying to break him. And he had no doubt she wasn't done. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he felt it deep in his gut. This was leading somewhere. Somewhere big. Somewhere bad. And the worst part? He had no idea what she was planning next. Jerry barely had time to process the latest harassment before the final blow came crashing down on him like a wrecking ball, literally. It started with an early morning wake-up call, not from his alarm clock, but from the deafening roar of engines outside his house. His body jolted upright as he rubbed his eyes, his mind struggling to catch up with the sudden noise. The walls of his bedroom vibrated as the sound grew louder, heavier, like a stampede of mechanical beasts rolling down his peaceful street. Panic shot through him as he leapt out of bed, grabbing his phone before rushing to the window. What he saw sent ice through his veins. A massive bulldozer was pulling up in front of his house, accompanied by a fleet of construction trucks, a demolition crew already stepping out, stretching, adjusting their hard hats, getting ready for something. His house. Jerry's stomach twisted into a knot so tight it hurt. His feet barely touched the floor as he sprinted to the front door, throwing it open with enough force to nearly rip it off its hinges. Hey! Stop! He shouted, his voice cracking from both the early morning grogginess and the sheer disbelief of what was happening. One of the workers, a tall man holding a clipboard, barely glanced at him before muttering, "Sir, please step aside. We have orders to proceed." Orders. Jerry's breath came in short bursts as he tried to process the words, his pulse pounding so hard in his ears he could barely think. Orders. They had orders. From who? His eyes darted across the street, and sure enough, standing there like a villain watching her plan unfold, was Brenda. Arms crossed, head slightly tilted, an expression so infuriatingly smug it made Jerry's hands curl into fists. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Jerry turned back to the clipboard guy, shoving past the crew as they began unloading their tools. Orders from who? He snapped. Because I sure as hell didn't sign off on this. The man flipped through his papers lazily, barely registering Jerry's outrage. This demolition has been authorized due to safety concerns. According to the HOA. I'm not in the HOA. Jerry roared, his voice so sharp and full of rage that even a few of the workers hesitated mid-step. His chest heaved as he pointed a trembling finger at Brenda. This is illegal. You have no right to be here. If you touch so much as a single brick of my house, I will have every last one of you arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property. For the first time, the clipboard guy actually looked at him. He let out a slow breath, shifting uncomfortably, and that's when Jerry saw it, that tiny flicker of doubt in his eyes. The HOA might have fed them some nonsense about an official order, but they hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected a homeowner standing in his doorway, in nothing but sweatpants, ready to go to war to protect what was his. Jerry wasted no time. His phone was already in his hand, and before Brenda could slither her way over with more lies, he was dialing. 911, what's your emergency? The words barely had time to leave the operator's mouth before Jerry launched into a breathless explanation. I need officers here immediately. There's an unauthorized demolition attempt happening on my property, and the people behind it have no legal right to be here. His voice was shaking, but not from fear, from pure, undiluted fury. The operator assured him that officers were on their way, and Jerry hung up, turning his attention back to the demolition crew. He planted himself in front of his house, arms spread wide, breathing hard. "Nobody touches this house until the police get here," he said, his voice low and lethal. The clipboard guy hesitated again, exchanging glances with the workers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Brenda finally decided to make her grand entrance, sauntering over like she had already won. "Jerry, you're making a scene," she said, feigning concern. "If you had just cooperated from the start, none of this would be necessary." Jerry let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Necessary?" He gestured wildly toward the bulldozer, the workers, the chaos unfolding in his front yard. "You're about to destroy someone's home because they wouldn't pay your ridiculous fees and bow down to your insane rules. Do you even hear yourself?" Brenda's lips curled into a practiced, polite smile, but her eyes were sharp and full of venom. "This isn't personal, Jerry. It's about maintaining the integrity of the community. Your home has been deemed a hazard. By who?" Jerry cut her off, stepping closer, nearly shaking with rage. "Your fake inspector? The same one who conveniently found violations, right after I refused to join? You're a joke." Her expression twitched just for a second before she regained her composure. "The community has standards," she said simply. "And you, Jerry, don't meet them." The police arrived before Jerry could physically strangle her. 2 officers stepped out of their cruiser, hands resting on their belts, scanning the situation. Jerry wasted no time running up to them, shoving every document he had into their hand. "This is my house," he said, breathless but determined. "The HOA has no jurisdiction here. They've been harassing me for months, fabricating violations, and now they're trying to demolish my home without any legal authority." The officers took one look at the paperwork and immediately turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, do you have legal documentation proving this demolition is authorized?" Brenda hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she handed over her own stack of papers. Jerry watched closely as the officer flipped through them, his expression shifting from neutral to something much less patient. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "This isn't legally enforceable," he said firmly. "The HOA has no right to carry out a demolition on private property without a court order. This is trespassing at best, destruction of property at worst." Brenda's face darkened, her grip on her coffee mug tightening. "Officer, I think you're misunderstanding." "No," Jerry snapped, cutting her off. "You're misunderstanding. Your little reign of terror? It ends today." The officers turned to the demolition crew. "Pack it up. This job is cancelled." Just like that, the workers started gathering their equipment, exchanging awkward glances as they loaded everything back onto their truck. The clipboard guy mumbled an apology before trudging off, clearly eager to be done with this disaster. Jerry felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was far from over. Brenda wasn't going to let this go, not without one last dig. "You think this is over?" she murmured, low enough so only Jerry could hear. "You may have one today, but I promise you, I always get what I want." Jerry smiled, a slow, victorious smile that made her stiffen. "Not this time," he said. "And not ever again." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal battles and media coverage. Jerry's lawyer wasted no time filing a lawsuit against the HOA, citing harassment, emotional distress, and attempted destruction of private property. The local news ate the story up, turning Brenda into a public villain overnight. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before finally came forward, sharing their own horror stories about her oppressive rule. Under pressure and facing mounting legal fees, Brenda finally resigned as HOA president. The lawsuit settled in Jerry's favor, awarding him a hefty sum in damages.
But more than that, he had his home, his peace, his freedom. As he sat on his deck weeks later, watching the sunset with a beer in hand, he let out a long, satisfied sigh. The battle had been brutal, exhausting, and at times infuriating. But in the end, he had won. Damn, it felt good.